I'm delighted to say that Andrew Mitchell joins me in the studio. Andrew, thank you so much for coming in.
Good evening.
And just before we came on air, I asked you whether you were okay to be here. You've lost a friend and a colleague this weekend. I'd like to extend my sympathies to you and my condolences. You knew David very well. So obviously your colleagues in Conservative Party, but I believe neighbours in Parliament as well.
Yes, we had adjacent rooms in 1 Parliament Street, the building just beside Portcullis House. And he, of course, was one of the longest-serving members of Parliament. He came in 1983, so he was there when I arrived in 1987. And he's always been a friend. Our politics are slightly different. I would say he's slightly to the right of me, or was, sadly. But on
you were a
agree.
Cameroon, I suppose. Is that fair to say?
I was... Well,
One Nation Tory?
I'm the chairman of the One Nation group of Conservative members of Parliament. So I'm a One Nation Tory. But, you know, he was very much someone who made up his own mind about the issues he thought were most important and how he should vote. So, for example, he was one of the 26 of us who voted against the cuts in development aid. So, you know, he was quite difficult to pigeonhole, but he was a very, very good member of Parliament. Indeed,
and you just talked about what a warm-hearted person he was, and you told me this amazing story about overhearing him dictating a letter to a constituent. I mean, would you mind telling me that story? Because I think it's charming.
Well, in the book I say that, and this, which of course was written a long time before the tragic events of last Friday, I say that members of Parliament are kinder than their public image often, and I repeat a story about how I once went into his office and he was there dictating a letter to his constituent. And the letter went as follows. Dear Mrs. Smith, I was very sorry indeed to hear about the sad death of Percy. New paragraph. Percy was a much-loved budgerigar. And it showed, I think, the empathy with his constituents. Their sadnesses were sadnesses that he shared, no matter how big or small. And, you know, you've seen over this weekend the outpouring of sadness and misery from his constituency, and I think it's very, very genuine.
You were within your rights to cancel this interview, and it's a credit to you that you're here, and it gives us an opportunity to remember Sir David Amess, but also to look at the situation now for MPs as they engage with the public and if they conduct their surgeries, of course. Now, do you think things should change? Should there be security for MPs? Should there be a dedicated environment, perhaps plastic screens? What needs to happen going forward?
Well, I think Priti Patel is absolutely right as Home Secretary to say these matters should be reviewed and we need to take advice from those who are experts in security matters. But, you know, if you do start putting barriers between members of Parliament and their constituents, then the bad guys win. And I think it's very important we do our very best to keep this quite intimate relationship which exists with our constituents, where, you know, I wander through the town of Sutton Coldfield. I've been there for more than 20 years now. I know lots of people. They come up to me. They give me their views for and against what the government is doing. And that is at the heart of the way we conduct our democratic processes. So after the murder of Joe Cox, we looked at the security that we have in the office in Sutton Coldfield, and I think we got the balance about right. And I don't intend to change that. These are terrible events, but mercifully they are very unusual. And, of course, there are other people in public life and in the public sector who put themselves in with the public, who face the same risks that members of Parliament do. And I basically want to keep it as much as possible as it is at the moment, consistent with taking that advice.
Do you feel less safe now? Do you feel perturbed? Are your family members and friends worried about you when you hold these surgeries and when you do go walkabout?
I don't feel less safe. As I say, I think these awful events happen very rarely, thank goodness. And I don't think we should change the procedures that make British democracy what it is.
So, David, where were you when you got the news that he'd been attacked? Because, I mean, most of us sort of, you know, heard about the stabbing, and then an hour or two later we had the awful news that he'd lost his life. So where were you when you heard the news?
Well, I was arriving at Bishop Walsh School in my constituency as I heard the news that he had been attacked. And I didn't see I was speaking to the sixth form there, and I didn't see the awful news that he died until I came out of that meeting.
Yeah. And I mean, you knew his family, you knew his wife, Julia?
I didn't know them very well. I knew David, and he and I had competed in the Westminster Dog of the Year competition, our dogs rather than ourselves. And he was a tremendous animal lover. And indeed, you could hear the squawk of the bird that lives in his office as you went down the corridor in 1 Parliament Street.
Now, police have held a 25-year-old man. He's a British man of Somali origin, and they're treating this as a potential terror-related incident. What are your thoughts about how we tackle this hatred towards Western values?
Well, the police will have to do their work, and we will then discover more, I think, about the motive behind this appalling and senseless killing. I think that the lessons from all of this are that we need to be confident in our values. We need to be confident in the necessary security with which we protect public figures. And I think we need to be confident in those values because they are values which have come to us from our forebears and which are incredibly important. And I don't think they can be allowed to be shaken by these sort of terrible events.
And what about whether we can actually tackle the source of this evil, this hatred? So much of it is fermented online, and it's clearly a global problem. But other than beefing up security, I mean, can we treat it at the other end and tackle how this actually happened?
Well, I think it is social media that has made it so much worse. And I think particularly for women, it's made it really, truly terrible. And we've seen this from what some of my colleagues on both sides of the House have said in recent days. I think the government are looking at the argument for removing anonymity. And it is clear that people are prepared to say things online which they would never say if they were face-to-face. So I think change needs to come, and anonymity being granted to people online, I think, is one of the changes that we should be looking at.
Have you ever felt unsafe as an MP going about your business? Have you faced peril other than perhaps, nasty tweets or letters? Has anything more serious happened to you in the past?
I have never felt unsafe in going about my role as a Member of Parliament, and I've never felt unsafe in my constituency either.
Now, the book's out. I'm very excited. A rip-roaring read, says Andrew Rawnsley in The Observer today. It's winning rave reviews. It's witty and also a great insight into the world of politics. Beyond a Fringe, Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey. Explain the title.
Well, it occurred to me during lockdown. It's all really Michael Crick's fault that I wrote this book, because we were discussing what to do in lockdown, and he said to me that if I didn't tell some of those stories I'd told him over the years about Boris Johnson and about the Whip's office, he was going to put them in his own diary, and that sort of set things in train. But I did think to myself that I have been a member of virtually all the sort of key parts of the British establishment, from prep school, public school, the army, Cambridge, Parliament, the Cabinet and so forth. And most of those institutions have changed, some of them out of all recognition. So this is not a book from a politician trying to self-justify. It's not a book from a politician trying to describe the route to utopia.
And you're not settling scores either.
And I'm not settling any scores. And I'm basically, I hope, trying to entertain and perhaps amuse, for the most part.
Yeah, and that's certainly the flavour of the reviews. Now, you were in investment banking after your stint in the military. So why would you enter politics? Why didn't you just make money and have a quiet life?
Well, I think I come from a political family. My father was in the House of Commons.
30 years?
Yes. I mean, I think
so it's in the blood.
So probably. There have been 4 members of Parliament from the family in the House of Commons over the last 200 years. The first 2 were Liberals, so we don't talk about them. But my father...
Black sheep of the family.
My father was there, and so I sort of saw the pluses and minuses of politics at one remove round the kitchen table. And so I suspect it was in my blood. But, when I was first living in London after university, I used to shout at the television, and several of my friends said, well, why don't you, instead of shouting at television, why don't you get involved? So I did, and it all sort of followed from that.
Yes. I mean, did your father's life in politics, I mean, was it attractive? Did you admire him? Did you think, I'd like to do that one day?
Yes, I think there's quite a lot of members of Parliament, actually, who've had relations who've gone before them in the House of Commons. And I think that you know, in a way a bit like teaching or even the priesthood. Being an MP is a vocation. So for many people, it's a very unattractive career, and they can't imagine why people that go into it. But for those who do, I mean, I think it's a drug almost. It gets into your bloodstream. And your commitment, hopefully for the right reasons, drives you forward. And I think that I've certainly felt that in my bloodstream, really. Yes.
Let's talk about the dark arts of being a government whip. I mean, that's a very skillful and challenging role, isn't it? And quite a 24/7 role as well.
Well, I write about the Whip's office in the 90s, and in particularly over Maastricht, because whipping has changed so much. So I feel that it's OK to write, at least to quite a great extent, about what happened those days, because the change is so great. And I try to describe what is a very different type of parliament to what exists today. When I first came into the House of Commons, there's a picture in my office taken from the press gallery, looking down across both sides of the House, and almost everyone is grey-haired, wearing a dark suit and a waistcoat. There's very, very few women, let alone people from the minority communities, and that has changed, thank goodness. We're much more like the country we seek to represent and to govern now. So there's enormous change, and the Whip's office too has changed. I mean, when I first was in the House of Commons, there were members of the government Whip's office who'd had a good war and had military crosses.
Right.
So there is a huge, huge change.
And what is the skill set required of a good government whip? I mean, is it a long memory?
I think you need to know the people for whom you are responsible, your flock, the 20 or so members of Parliament, extremely well, and understand what motivates them, and know their characters, what are the pluses and minuses.
And is it a good platform, a good foundation for a career in the Cabinet, for example? Is it a good place to start, the Whip's office?
Well, Michael Heseltine said that his great regret about his time in the House of Commons was that he was never a whip. And he felt that if you were a whip, it gave you skills and knowledge, which you wouldn't get from being a departmental minister. So I think there's a strong argument for, if you have, I mean, you don't have a choice in these things, but if you did, for becoming a whip before you go out into a department. And the whips are at the centre of the wheel. So, in theory at least, they know everything about everything. The department, or out at the edge of the spokes, out in Whitehall, not centred in the House of Commons. And the whips, you know, they turn on the lights in the morning and turn them off last thing.
Yeah, remarkable. So, as you wrote the book, I mean, was it gratifying to look back on all of your years in Parliament?
Well, I make it clear in the book, I'm not planning, it's not thank you and good night.
No way.
I'm trying to emulate the example of my brilliant predecessor, Norman Fowler, who wrote a book in mid-career. And I may not quite be in mid-career, but I certainly hope to represent my constituents and stand up for the causes which I think are important for many years to come.
Well, you most certainly will. So what about some of those juicy stories in the book? I mean, which particular episodes really stand out in your under your various briefs?
Well, I think I've tried in the different establishment institutions I describe to draw out some of the funnier stories. And also, you know, the extraordinary change in education for my time at prep school, which Boris Johnson also attended somewhat later than me, has now closed down. But, you know, there are things about life there which have changed out of all recognition, thank goodness. Yeah. And it's almost looking back at a completely different world. But the time, I think, where the most intensity, and I hope I've drawn out some humour, was over the Maastricht debates and the Whip's office and how we operated. Yes. Because, you know, in those days we were 16, all men. There were no women in the office in those days. And I probably saw more of my brothers in arms in the Whip's office over the Maastricht period than I saw of my wife and family. In fact, I definitely did.
Remarkable. And are you pinching yourself now that the issue of Europe, which divided the Conservative Party for decades, is now resolved? And what's your view about how Brexit is playing out?
Well, I do think that Europe saw off for the last 4 Conservative Prime Ministers. I do think that once the country had voted, whether you voted for Brexit or not. We live in a democracy, and Brexit had to happen. And I think that now that it's happened, there seems to be a sort of acceptance that, this is it. And it's drawn a lot of the poison of that debate, which, was part of what informed our earlier discussion. It's drawn a lot of that poison out of it.
Yeah.
And, Britain would succeed in or out of the European Union. And we've now got to gather ourselves up and make our way in the world, commercially and economically and through trade, but also in the values we hold dear, which need to inform the international system, where in the past Britain has had such a good influence, being a very bright light in some extremely difficult and dark places in the world.
So you've served under several prime ministers, including Margaret Thatcher, John Major, David Cameron, Theresa May. So maybe we could go through them one by one. Mrs. Thatcher, I mean, just tell us what it was like being in her presence.
Well, she was a goddess, really. And I was a very young MP in those days. And when she used to swish past in the corridors with her entourage, I used to stand firmly to attention and face straight ahead and hope that she would go by. And it was terrifying when she would come into the tea room, which she did a lot, actually. And she'd sit down and fix you with her beady eyes and ask you about the money supply figures that morning. And your answer quite often would be judged not wholly adequate. So, I mean, she was a figure of huge respect. She changed the country. She had saved us in many ways, brought back the British economy from being the sick man of Europe. And I respected her hugely.
Yes, and I mean, it was a challenging final term for her, wasn't it? Do you think that it was a sad time, given the fact that, she became increasingly isolated over Europe and various other issues? I mean, she fell out with half her cabinet.
Well, I was working at that stage for a member of that cabinet, John Wakeham, who was one of her strongest supporters and a very close friend of hers. So I had a front seat at the dramatic events which took place in the 24 hours before she resigned, which I describe in the book. I think that she should have gone earlier. I think that had she announced at her 10th, the anniversary conference in Blackpool, I think, after she'd done 10 years that she was going, the floor of the conference hall would have been knee-deep in tears, and she would have gone out on such a high. But, prime ministers never really know when to go, and they normally have to have their fingers prized off the railings of Downing Street.
Do you think David Cameron was an underrated prime minister?
I do, actually. I think that he provided very good government. I think his instincts were extremely decent. I mean, for me, I had run the campaign for his main opponent when he became leader, so it wasn't written in the stars that, he and I would necessarily have a good relationship. But we completely agreed about the central importance of international development. And the press said it was all about detoxifying the Conservative Party. It wasn't. It was because he understood the importance of soft power, where Britain could make a huge reputation for itself and have huge impact at driving down these egregious levels of poverty which disfigure our world. So, in the end, when he asked me to be his Shadow Development Secretary and then Development Secretary in government, we could complete each other's sentences. So it was a very happy relationship, me working for a Prime Minister with whom I completely agreed and who always supported me. There were 2 or 3 occasions when someone in Whitehall tried to go behind my back on decisions I was making about international development and went to the Prime Minister. And on all 3 of those occasions, the Prime Minister said, no, I think Andrew is right, do what Andrew has suggested.
And the coalition government was a very stable administration at a time of economic crisis.
Yes, I mean, I thought the coalition was a tremendous success, and I hugely enjoyed working with our Lib Dem colleagues. Now, not all my colleagues on the Tory benches would agree with that analysis, but I do think the coalition, at a difficult time, gave us the working majority we needed, which, of course, we didn't have after the election in 2010, and brought stability to government. So, like what the policies were or not, it did bring a stability, which was very necessary.
Yes, and I think in the course of the decade that followed the credit crunch, the global financial downturn, I think that the deficit went from 10% as a percentage of GDP down to about 2%, which put us on a strong footing for the pandemic and the economic crisis that would befall us a year and a half ago.
Yes, I mean, George Osborne was a very good Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I think that history will treat him better than this sort of ebb and flow of contemporary judgment.
I mean, we can debate austerity, the rights and wrongs. Other people think that we should have grown our way out of that particular economic crisis. But the bottom line is that we did have the economic firepower with which to handle the most recent crisis.
Yes, it gave us a stability. It meant there was something in the bank to draw down when this terrible pandemic crisis erupted.
What are your thoughts about the government's handling of the pandemic, particularly the curtailment of people's civil liberties? Many people feel, many viewers to this programme feel that it was a very unconservative way of handling a crisis.
Yes, I remember on the 23rd of March last year when Parliament gave ministers these quite extraordinary powers, and there was a lot of worry and anxiety on our benches about it. Because, of course, throughout the pandemic, ministers exercised arbitrary control and they were not held to account by the House of Commons and questioned and drilled down into the decisions they were making. And, of course, if you're in the executive, that's a wonderful way to govern, but it's not the right way in a democracy. There needs to be that accountability within the legislature. So I think it was at least in part necessary. I've worried about the extent of it, and I've worried about the time of it. But on the whole, I think it was unavoidable. But we can't keep these measures anymore. We have to make sure we get back to full accountability and full clarity and transparency.
Do you rate Boris Johnson?
I think that he was brilliant at getting Brexit through. I think the party had to be led by a Brexiteer after Mrs May. I did not support Mrs May when she became leader for the sole reason that I thought the party needed to be led by a Brexiteer and would be unmanageable without, which is exactly, I would submit, what happened. And I also think that Boris has been extremely good at adding on to the Tory DNA those red wall seats. And in the red wall seats, which have delivered up to Parliament some absolutely brilliant new colleagues who are real local champions, we've added that DNA to the Tory party. But my warning to my party is don't lose from the other end the internationalists and the people who really care about development and Britain's international work and reputation. Because it was the coalition which David Cameron got together which meant we won the 2015 election, which, remember, was the first time for 23 years the Conservative Party had won a majority in the House of Commons. And we did that by taking back all those Lib Dem seats from the West Country with people who voted for Cameron's party, Cameron's government in 2010. Because of his internationalist and socially liberal and broad approach. And so the key message for the Conservative Party is you must keep both those two ends on side if you're going to win majorities in Parliament at elections.
Andrew, let's power through a few questions. The clock is against us. We could talk to you for hours. Tom on email. Can we call that one up, please, Faye? This is from Tom on email. Lots of emails coming in. gbviews@gbnews.uk. You stated in September 2020 that Boris Johnson can't hold out forever against SNP demands for another referendum. Why do you take Nicola Sturgeon so seriously? And if she lost a second, when do you think the campaign for a third one would start? Do you think that we will see the breakup of the United Kingdom, or might we lose Scotland in our lifetimes?
I do remember making those comments, and I think that you cannot say no to another referendum forever. You just because they've had one and they lost it, you can't say they can never review that again, particularly if the SNP, as they do, have a majority in the Scottish Parliament. But equally, I think it's important this time that if there is to be a vote on this, people know what they're voting for. Because last time it was the theory of it. This time they need to know what it would mean for debt in Scotland, know what it would mean for public expenditure, know what it would mean for the currency, and are more informed. If you're going to have another referendum, and I very much doubt it's imminent, then you must have it on the basis of something that sets out for those who are voting exactly what it would mean. And I don't think, actually, that Scotland would vote for separation, because the union has been a tremendous success. It's elevated living standards in both countries. And I think that when all the facts are out there on the table, it will be possible for us to reach a sort of settlement in terms of self-government and devolution, which commands respect on both sides of the border and keeps the union together.
We won't get bogged down in pleb gates, because it strikes me you were the victim of a gross miscarriage of justice, and I think it's regrettable that your political career was interrupted as a result of allegations that you deny in terms of remarks you made. Let's talk about the future. Would you like to get back into the cabinet?
Well, I think in politics, it's very important not to base your happiness on office. And one of the things about David Amess...
That's very healthy.
And one of the things about David Amess, you see, that is so interesting, was that he wasn't particularly interested in office. He was interested in being a really good member of Parliament. And I think he was much happier as a result. And, you know, for all of us in Westminster, whatever we do, the contribution we are there to make is on behalf of those who elect us and send us down to serve their interests in Parliament. And my enthusiasm for looking after the royal town at Sutton Coldfield is completely undiminished. So I shall go on doing that, and I'll leave any question like the one you've asked to fate.
But never say never.
Well, you should never say never about anything in politics.
No, that's healthy. When's the next election coming, by the way? Do you know?
Goodness knows.
Spring 2023?
I would.
It won't go to full term, will it?
And Prime Ministers never like being up against the buffers, and so it won't go to full term. But there's an awful lot to be done, and Boris will want to see through this levelling up agenda so that it really means something to people on the ground.
Yeah.
And I think he'll want to go once that is clear. Well,
listen, it's been a phenomenal treat to have you on the programme, and also under the circumstances we're very grateful, and we completely would have understood if you'd decided not to join us, but we are very glad that you did. Remembering David Amess, a colleague and friend of yours, and an appropriate question from Gemma to finish our conversation. Gemma on email asks, have you been treated badly by other MPs in your time as an MP, and what's the kindest thing an MP has done for you? Maybe we'll forget the first half, maybe.
What's the kindest thing? I mean, I have been Chief Whip, so I think people being kind to the Chief Whip is an interesting concept. I think there have been all sorts of kindnesses from colleagues in the House of Commons, and I think the point I would make is one we touched on earlier, that members of Parliament are both kinder to each other and kinder in general than their public image. And, you know, you mentioned earlier on the programme, when I was watching it, the comments of Angela Rayner. I don't think Angela Rayner really believes that about Tories. I think she got carried away in a rhetorical flourish, because I and other Tories have good relations with Angela Rayner, rather respect her for what she has done in the past and where she's come from, and we respect her very much for that. And I'm not sure really that she did herself justice in making the remark about Tories that she did.
Andrew, do join us again, and let me tell our viewers that your book, which is set to be a bestseller, it's certainly winning rave reviews as an honest and entertaining mid-career political memoir. Early career, perhaps. Look at Churchill. Beyond a Fringe. Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey. It's by Andrew Mitchell, and it's out now.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.